Good Friday evening, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to Living Waters, Falling Deeper in Love with God's Word. I am Lauren Cruz.
And I am Stephanie Pavlantos. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. And we are continuing in our book study. We do a pretty good job of handling various book studies that have influenced our Messianic and Hebrew understanding of the Bible. And this one's a little different. It's called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. And basically it's telling us that everything we've ever read in the Bible is wrong because of our Western influence.
Right. We look at it through American eyes, through Western eyes, and we get a lot of things wrong because we don't take the time to study the culture and the language. So it would help us.
This week, it's our understanding of time. So we've gone through how our culture, our individualism versus being community, how that affects our understanding, how our word choices and language and understanding, how that
shame and honor.
Shame and honor. That's right. We did that last week. And now time. And I told Stephanie, I said, nothing major and new. I mean, I kind of see us doing this as we read it. It totally makes sense. But then it did kind of lead me to go into some other areas of the Bible that I've read. That he leaves the chapter with a really good challenge. I think it's an important challenge.
Yeah.
So So let's
it was good. I thought it was good. And not as many like last week. There were a lot of scriptural references and stories included. This time there weren't. He spent a little bit of time in the beginning of the chapter because he came from Indonesia. So he talks about how things happen there and how they are much like what we think of the Hebrew writers, the Jewish writers. So, yeah.
And he makes a point of really, setting the tone of how we as Westerners understand time. It's a commodity. It's rare. We're to pack everything into it that we can. I know as a teacher, I'm told to teach in my classroom bell to bell, like pack as much in that time frame as I can. And how we're very linear thinking, chronological thinking, and if things don't happen in a certain order, it kind of messes us up a little bit.
It's interesting because going back to the language chapter, he talked about when there are a lot of words for something, that means it's important to us. So we have a lot of words with time related to time, time and thinking about the past, the future, the present, that it's going to happen in the future, different things. And he's like, gives the example of run. I ran, I run, I have run, I will have run, and so I will run, so like all these different examples, but we take our English and we make it around all of that because it's important.
Okay. Well, he pretty much set the tone on that. And then he started telling us how we're doing it wrong. And he said, he actually makes a point, we have all these different ways of talking about run. And he says many languages do not make this distinction. So to us, why wouldn't they? We have a present tense, a future tense, and a lot of languages don't even have that. And I know I'm studying Hebrew with Lucille. She's on here a lot. Hi, Lucille. And I know Stephanie's done the same thing. And it's not even so much that you have a past tense. It just means the action's completed, and it's not a future tense. Like I'm going to go do this. It really just, it's a context thing. Like you kind of add the ED ending depending on the context of what you're reading. So even in Hebrew, they don't have a necessary tenses.
And you might even hear even a foreigner, somebody who doesn't know the English language, and they might say something like, I run, or to mean like right now, or I'm going to run, I run. And so, just like the way that we would think of it. And he talks about the example that in Indonesia, they have no verb tense. And as Americans, we couldn't even imagine not having a verb tense. But he says, They just talk about today or tomorrow. So if I said I'm going to go to the airport tomorrow, it would matter to us. Like the first thing my husband would say, well, what time are you going to the airport? When do I get you there? And it's just like, oh, tomorrow. That would be like, that would make him insane.
Well, I thought that he had a great, whether or not you say good morning to someone in Indonesia depends on the temperature, not the time of the day. Right. Yeah. So he's trying to say good morning to everyone. Yeah. And they're like, no, it's afternoon. And he's like, no, it's 10:30 in the morning. It's not, because we think of noon, and it's all based on what the temperature is.
Yeah. I thought that was hilarious because it's like, so why is it good morning or good afternoon at 10:30, but at 10 you said it's good morning or good afternoon? It's like, because it's already hot. No, it's already hot. So
that it makes me think of something. This is a way we kind of misinterpret things in the Bible. I'm just going to use a Samaritan woman as an example. It's always saying that she went to the well at the hottest time of the day, and it's always, she was there at noon, and
right.
Honestly, if you think about it, that's not the hottest time of the day. The hottest time is like 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's like super hot then. So even that, our misunderstanding, we've just kind of set a time frame on it, and it's not even accurate.
Exactly. Yeah. Excuse me.
All right. Well, what page are we up to, you think?
Well, I talked about what's on 139, so we're going to go 140.
Okay. Yeah, 140 is when he's talking about the different.
Yeah, and he said right there in the middle of the page, in the West, the correct time is usually connected to a clock. Westerners today view time as discrete, meaning a separate unit, and thus quantifiable. In the non-Western world, by contrast, the correct time is also connected to a condition or situation, and that's what you brought up.
Right.
So, yeah, and even like he talked about, starting church, and there were other examples he gives later. I won't jump ahead, but yeah, I thought it was funny just the way, like, you come now. Yeah, I'll come whenever. I'll be there.
When I get there.
Yeah, I'll be there when I get there. It's like, there's no like setting someone to a time that they would show up, even to do work. There's no setting someone to a specific day and time.
That's right. Right. On 141, he kind of moves into now, this is how it applies to as we read the Bible. And he's pretty clear. We like to have a clear beginning. And a matter of fact, the Bible starts with in the beginning, right? Yeah. And then, chronologically, we have Revelation at the end because that's the end of times, so to speak. Yeah. But honestly, the Bible is not ordered in a chronological time. It skips around, and there's even in the book of Genesis, you go through the 7-day creation period, and then you've got this other little mini story kind of inserted, and you're like, wait a minute, we've already passed day 3. Why are we back at day 6? It's a weird.
And people use that, especially Westerners use that to say why the Bible's so inaccurate. And I mean, even like when my son took biology, and I remember back in my 20s when I was working at a cancer research center, and we had some interns, and I remember them bringing up to me, well, my professor said that because he repeats a story in chapter 2, Genesis 1 and 2, they were talking about, and that just shows that it's messed up. You don't even know when things were created because, and I'm like, really? Like, I mean, I just found that interesting because I didn't read the Bible that way. I didn't like think that, just because he started retelling a story in chapter 2 and went back to a certain time in that week, and it could have even been a few days later in some respects, but so to them the whole Bible was wrong,
right? And I know I'm jumping ahead, and I'll say this and pause and catch up when we get there, but that retelling of a story or inserting like a few more details into the story, it's a very Jewish study way, and a very Jewish way of writing. Just like we said this before, when you read one book of the Bible, generally the next book it's not that it happened next, but but it's there because it's a commentary of what you just read. So it's more information.
And even like the difference in the Torah, like you have the first 4 books, and then Deuteronomy is a retelling of the Torah, but instead of being in first person, like Moses was talking between Moses and God, now it's Moses not including his own name and himself, and he's retelling the story. So it's very interesting. Yeah. So that we just, and without knowing that, it doesn't make, certain things don't make sense.
Right. He makes the point that he makes is that we tend to like want a chronological beginning and an end, but in Jewish writing and Bible writing, it's very cyclical. There's a cycle of things. And even thinking about this, and this took me a while when I was writing my book, I had to kind of, how do I explain this so that we'll understand it? We have 7 days, and then we have the 8th day. And a lot of times we think that, oh, day number 8 is starting a new week. But really in Hebrew thinking, it's the 8th day, which is the end of a cycle, but beginning of another cycle. It's hard to explain. It's not that it's a whole new week. It's just the beginning of a cycle and the starting and the end of it's kind of a pivot point. So,
and then when you get to like, even with Jesus, then Yeshua, you have hit the number of his name being 888, so it's the number 8 is, like you said, it's like beginning a new cycle. And so it's very interesting to think of it that way, but we don't do that. So we have a new Sydney Adams.
Yeah. So I think I know who that is. I think I think I know her.
So, and then let's make a comment. So Jewish writing is a genre. So,
it is. It's a whole thing. That's right.
It's a whole different way of writing, and just like we've talked before, but even to read the creation story, it's not a science book. It was never meant to be a science book.
It's a narrative. It is a story. It is historical. But honestly, the Bible is written for you to just read it and see this overview and if, when you see those little dips into something, then that's an important part. Then that should give your signal to,
And of course, the chiasms in there. When you see things repeated several times, it's probably a chiasm because they're making a point and they do it right in a certain order.
Right.
And I don't know if he ever gets into anything like that in here, but if that's a whole nother thing we could take a whole show to teach. And so, then on page 142, I have at the top the introduction, those 2 Greek words.
Right.
So chronos, which we often hear, even if you don't know Greek, you've probably heard chronos.
Right. It's a common prefix in time, chronological, chronos. Right. It's a very specific time. That one generally it's translated as the word time, but that chronos is a very specific time, date, hour, minute, very specific.
Yeah. And then we have a season, which is kairos. And so that is a season. It's like think of the example comes to me, it's the spring. So not just that's a season, but where the spring feasts happen, they happen in the spring. So that's a season of time. When do a lot of weddings happen? In June? That's the season. And you could just like kind of look at it like that's when, when's your wedding? June.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then it's like, but it doesn't matter what the specific
and the problem is it's translated as time often in the Bible. Sometimes it is translated as season, but the fullness of time. We've seen that phrase before. It's not the fullness of a specific day or hour. It's the fullness of his season or the fullness of it's a bigger incorporation of things. Yeah. Lucille's asking, how is Shavuot affected by time? That's a good question.
Well, he does. Well, yeah, I actually posted an article because that's Passover. That's Pentecost, what we might think of as Pentecost. But Pentecost is not just about the giving of the Holy Spirit. It started back in Exodus when it was the giving of the 10
Law.
Commandments, the law.
Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting because when I read this just today, and I was telling Lauren about it, but when we often think that it was poured out, the Spirit was poured out on everyone. But again, it's that time, in the sense that in the Bible we read it as all happening at the same time, but in fact it didn't. It was poured out on the Jews first, and then the Gentiles that the Jews were bringing to Yeshua. So in our minds we look at it all happening at one time, but it really didn't. There was time. It was a season, and that season lasted for many years before it was poured out on what we might say as Gentiles. So
when you were talking about this earlier, I was thinking, the book of Acts, we read it and we think all that's like within a couple of weeks right after his crucifixion. But honestly, it's three journeys of Paul. So it's multiple years, it's many years over time. It's not just a couple of weeks and the beginnings of the new church, and they immediately called themselves a church. And I mean, we had
this happened hundreds of years.
We had spans of time before
because it's still very much a Jewish
thing. Right. Yeah, there was hundreds of years that they still looked very Jewish. Another verse that comes to mind is nobody knows the day or the time. You've heard that a lot, and it's not a specific time. It's a season. It's like nobody knows the season in which he'll come. And actually the Bible does give us a lot of clues about the specific season of his return. So,
and we don't realize, like, when you read the Bible, especially John, everything is around a feast, because that is what he wrote about. He set his story up to happen around the feast and the temple. So what was happening? So when we don't understand that, then you think like, oh, this happened back to back, or they were going to Jerusalem. Well, if they were going to Jerusalem, more likely it was for a feast.
Right.
And so that's what was going on. And so you have to look for those signs of the feast days being written in there. So,
yeah. And the timing of it, the Bible does say this was at Passover, or this was at the barley harvest, or, something. So those are there to give us, the early reader would have 100% knew it immediately. We don't know that so much, but those are there as landmarks or time marks.
And even when Jesus was in the temple at 12 years old, well, that's his bar mitzvah. There's something significant going on, which is why they were there. And it gives us his age, because that's significant for that culture.
Right. So, it was right. Okay. So I went in, I wrote my notes. I had some notes in here when they were talking about kairos in the Bible, we're talking about seasons, and I made the note of feasts in Moedim, and I kind of translated those words to just as a reminder for me, and he even, I had to say, I finally hit something. I disagree with him. On page 143, he was going over the story of Jesus's birth, and he was saying that he was trying to make the point of the wise men coming to see him at, when he was much older, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. And I don't agree with that. I think he was there at a feast. I think he saw that. I think they did see them, see the Holy Family when he was much smaller.
Because it was a feast, and we don't realize that why he was, again, it centers around their feast. Everything centers, and we've learned this from some of the other books we've read, that actually those little nativity scenes you set up that have the wise men there are actually correct.
All this time. So, I mean, he's got some very good things. It says this is problematic because more often than not, the biblical writers are describing kairos, not chronos. But in our mind, we're inserting a time. And really we should take the word season.
Right. Because more than likely she didn't have the baby as soon as she got to Bethlehem.
Right.
You know? And so there was some time. And again, and he brought this up, and it was a community. She was not alone.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't in some barn with Joseph trying to deliver a baby. They had women and family who would have helped and taken over. And so we have to keep it all. We have to read the story in light of culture, community, and language and time.
I think it depends on the context. Sometimes it's easier for us to make this shift or not. Because when Jesus says, you know, my hour has not come, I think most of us understand him saying my season, or it's like, you know, it's not, we're not looking for a specific hour. Yeah. The timing isn't right yet. We can understand that. So I think it really depends on that context and who's talking and really what our understanding of that passage is. I think it definitely influences it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And he tells a funny story there about the carpenter, and they said the carpenter's coming. And it says you can't, because he needed some cabinets built, and when he lived in Indonesia, and he said you can't expect him to just drop everything and come now, can you? And if he wants paid, he will, you know. And they said about a month later, the carpenter showed up with an apprentice, and he said they moved into our carport, and so they brought food and they moved in there. That's where they slept. That's where they cooked, because they had to come from another island. Oh, we don't have any carpenters on this island. You have to go to the next island over there, you know? So again, it's like a 2-day trip, right? Or something like that to get.
Well, he ended up staying for like a month because everyone puts him to work. Because
but by the time he found out, he sent a messenger, and the messenger took a week to get home to let him know that the carpenter was coming.
Right.
A month later. So yeah, it was funny. That was a funny story. And then the next one, he continued on with Joseph and the birth of Jesus, and then he just kind of goes on to different stories. But it was, and he talked about like the year 2000 and Y2K and so, and that was more like the end of time as we know it, but it wasn't at all.
It wasn't. Yeah. I liked on page 145 how a lot of things highlighted and underlined there. So, yeah.
I have almost every paragraph.
Do you? Yeah. Right at the top, he says, you know, because we in the United States fret over time, we figure that God does too. And I mean, if you've ever had to wait for an answer to prayer, or you've ever had to wait to find out if something's going to happen, you know, we're not very patient people. When we pray, you know, we want an answer quickly. You know, we want this taken care of immediately. And, you know, we put it on God. We put our timing on God. And, you know, he doesn't want this to happen for a long time. And I mentioned to Stephanie, and I'm sure people have heard this before. We're linear. We're on a timeline. You know, we can only think this way: first, second, last, end, beginning, end. And I've heard time being described as more of a spoke, you know, and so you have a spoke in the middle, a wheel of time that just goes, and God sits in the middle. And so he can see all of time always at the same time, right? Like there is no beginning or end to him, because he sees it all constantly as a spoke. So to me, that helps me kind of put it in a 3D, you know, kind of idea a little bit better, and have a little bit better of understanding that, you know, my timing is nothing compared to what's going on. So
right. And we often think of prayer as being, you know, an answer is yes, no, or maybe, or not now, but sometimes it's yes, but it's not going to happen for years.
Right.
And we don't think that way, that must be a no, like you said, you know. So it's interesting because, I mean, I remember having a situation in my life at a job happening when I was in my early 20s, and it was just a really difficult time in my life. But it wasn't until I was in my 50s that I understood it. It took that long, 30 years, to understand why it happened the way it did and what God was doing. That was crazy for me, though. I would have never expected. I just kept thinking, well, he's never going to tell me, give me the answer to why these things happened the way they did. And and so it's, yeah, but it may be 30, 40 years before we
Yeah. I think this is a good quote too. It says, many non-Westerners were less concerned with the clock or calendar time, chronos, but more concerned with the appropriateness and the fittingness of events, kairos. So I think we're more Westerners. We want the clock and to wait or to be patient or to apply it to a time that works better is a very hard discipline for us.
Yeah. And then the next thing I kind of highlighted all over the place was he said, let's look at the example when Jesus that Jesus used, and he spoke to them in parables, saying the kingdom of heaven is like the king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son.
Yeah.
He said,
this was a good story. This was good.
Yeah. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. And he said, we think they're all making excuses, but in the Eastern mindset, that was okay. People had lives, and you didn't, you had to wait for things to come. So even though the wedding was going to take place, maybe like if we use again June, well, you didn't know when things were going to get there, and you didn't know the weather. So
that was the point.
If that day was a rainy day, then guess what? It wasn't going to happen then.
Yeah.
And then you don't kill the fatted calf until the day you're going to eat it, because there was no refrigeration. So all of these things, it was like, okay, now the time is right. We've got our guests have come. We have everything we need. The wine got here, whatever we were waiting on, the oil, and now, and the weather's good. So go fill it.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So it was, so it was normal. They understood that kind of stuff. And so we look at it very differently.
Very differently. So, we, for the guests to not show up, we think that, oh, what a terrible insult. But think about that. Like if you're harvesting or you're in the middle, you just had a baby. I mean, a lot of things could happen, and someone knocks on your door and says, "Come now, the wedding's now." Would you get up and go? It's coming, and so you have to kind of be prepared. And that's kind of that. It makes sense now when you hear stories like the 10 virgins and go get your bride, and you hear those verses. Now that makes a little more sense, because we should be kind of anticipating, like, okay, we could hear about it any time now, any minute now, any day now, but we don't have an exact time. That's why it's so important to be ready to go. But sometimes guests could not, and it's understood. That's okay. Life continues on. So.
Yeah, they announced the banquet is happening soon. They didn't give an exact date.
Give an exact date. Yeah, that would drive the Westerners crazy.
It's like, what do you
mean?
Now,
not only do we have a wedding invitation, but now a year in advance you have a save the date invitation.
I know. So we had friends that called us this morning and said, "Hey, can you get together tonight?" And for my husband, he's just like, "Hold it, what? They're just asking us today," because like. He's got every day planned, like exactly what he needs to get done each day. And so for him, it's just like, why would they ask us today to go out tonight? Where me, I'm like impulsive. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'm ready. I can do that. Just,
let's go.
So it's very different. So now he talks about, he gives that story, Chronos, in the Bible. On the bottom of 146 was interesting, because I guess this book, Slaughterhouse-Five, it was written in 1966. He tells about the Billy Pilgrim is the main character and his unintentional time travel. And so he goes, this book basically, us as Westerners, we'd go crazy reading this book, because things aren't happening in chronological order. He's jumping around.
Right.
And he compares that to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that the reason we don't see everything in the Gospels all the same was because, number one, any eyewitness is going to tell you a different story than a different eyewitness. Right. They're going to write it different. They're going to explain it different. That's just the nature of human beings. But number two, my sister's on. But number two, you have people that what was I going to say? It was like they told the story centered around certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can give some examples about that, because that was really interesting too.
Well, it comes to mind because this is funny. I kind of teach point of view in English when I teach English, and I'll say, okay, there were 8 people at an intersection, and they all witnessed a car accident. But you have 8 different stories of what happened because of where they're standing and what they see. Like, this guy's behind a bush, so he didn't see the car over here. And, so we go through that. And
you ever see there was a movie like made that way? Like, every character had their own segment of the movie because everybody saw the same thing happen, but the 6 different characters all saw it from a different vantage point of view.
Right.
It was very interesting in what they,
so that's easy to understand too. But also, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's not even the order they were written in. So even in Mark is first. Mark was written first.
Yeah, and people think Matthew was written first, and that's why it's first, but it wasn't.
Right. So
I didn't know you read that book in high school. That's cool.
There you go.
So it's just it's you have to get used to the way that they tell stories and the reason they put things in a certain order. And for all you who like to post like on Facebook, like NIV, King James, and what's missing, there's a reason for that, because different manuscripts are used.
Right.
There's not one manuscript for the entire Bible.
Yeah.
There are many manuscripts, and the King James often used the Greek manuscripts for both the Old and New Testament, where some of the others used other manuscripts or even Hebrew manuscripts for the Old and the New Testament. And so the Bible wasn't all written in Greek. I mean, even the New Testament was not all written in Greek like we have been told or we think. And so so you may have this manuscript over here that, well, they didn't include these scriptures. It's not that somebody's trying to deceive you. Let me just say that. No one's trying to deceive you. The NIV is not trying to crash your party of what you think happened. And, so we have to get over those kinds of things and those kinds of judgments. Actually, the King James the King James version is more often incorrect because they used all Greek manuscripts. But I know that's an argument for some people, so I'm not trying to.
The other thing too is what she's referencing is there's been folks that have posted, and then like they'll say this verse is in the King James and it's not in the NASB, a certain verse in Matthew
or NIV or ESV.
Right. And it's not that we're hiding anything or, I caught you. This is the verse that's taken. It's not that. Here's another example. The book of Mark stops like at the end of the last chapter. I think it ends like on verse 16 of that last chapter. That the original manuscript, that's where it stopped. So you had hundreds of years of Bibles that just had that, and they found more, right? So as they updated things, they were able to add more later, hundreds of years later. And so you're going to see Bibles that stop at a certain point of Mark, and then more has been added.
Yeah, and you don't even realize that when we the Lord's Prayer that we repeat.
Yes.
The King James added that in to the glory and honor forever and ever. I mean, the King James added those words. They are not in the original Greek manuscripts, and we don't get that because we just think bad ESV, bad NIV. Those people are trying to deceive us, and they're not adding. And we have to keep these things in perspective and do our own research. So that's my rant for the night.
I highly recommend reading a variety of versions. I mean, you have to, because I'm just going to continue to beat up on King James, but it was commissioned by a king, to kind of to make kingdom and kings look good. So that's why it's in this old English, high honor English. They didn't talk like that. That's not how they talked. But that was like the high English of the kings and the courts.
Right. And it's a very social, aristocratic type of language. And
the words like bishop and cardinal and, those kind of places in the church, pastor, those were not they're not in the Bible. The word bishop is not in the Bible in the original Hebrew manuscript, because if you think of the early church, that wasn't a thing. They didn't have bishops. The church wasn't created in that structure for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So as they were translating things, they're like, oh, well, we need to beef up our need for these cardinals and these bishops because they're in my court and they have jobs in the church. So we better identify them in the Bible because people are going to start reading the Bible now. So
yeah, and the Bible's not political. It was never meant to be any more than it was meant to be a science book.
Right.
So we can't put politics in there. That it was the Catholic Church that made it political.
Right.
They made it political, and we have to balance out what we're hearing in history and what we're told by what's truth. And so that's
read lots of versions. It's okay. You're not going to go to hell if you read a lot of versions.
Yeah, you're not a sinner because you don't read King James.
Exactly.
So I'm going to get hate mail.
I know. We will. Okay, well, I'm going to read a point on 148 because I have a whole bunch highlighted there. Historically, Western readers have been bothered by what they consider discrepancies in the Bible. This is kind of wrapping up what we're talking about regarding chronologically. When two biblical books were written or writers present the same information in a different order or chronicle the same event but in different details, scholars are quick to assume that means that one of them is right or wrong. But in fact, what's more interesting is that we want to figure out which sequence is right, and for us to then correct that sequence and be chronologically accurate. That's what our brain does automatically. Automatically, we want to fix the sequence.
We can't help it.
We put things in order. So, okay. On page 149, we're gonna take a little bit of a rabbit trail if it's okay.
But I did like which part on 148 did you read? Because I have two things marked and I lost where you were. Sorry.
That was right in the middle, historically, right in the middle.
That's what I have, and then I just had so that's good. Because I did like that, and I just I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm lost. Where are you? Okay, and he said at the top of 149, then he said, for Matthew, the correct sequence is the one that has the crescendo event on a mountain where Jesus is taken to the high mountain to view the world's kingdoms. Right. Either scenario is likely to bother Western readers because that's not how Luke put it. And that was on the other page. And he said, but shouldn't the writers have told the story in the correct sequence? I suspect Matthew and Luke would both insist they did. Moreover, they would likely insist that the other evangelists did as well. Yeah, Matthew put it in the right order. I put it in the right order. And he said the chronological sequence simply didn't matter to them in the same way it matters to us.
Right.
So
he then goes into a really interesting example, and this part I did enjoy. This is the story in Mark 5:22 through 24, and it is the story of when Jairus comes and requests his daughter to be healed. Jesus agrees, they're on their way, and in the middle of it that's happening, a woman touched the cloak of his garment.
I love this.
And that it's kind of then her story is inserted, and you're like, wait a minute, we're not done with Jairus. Don't start another story because we're not done with Jairus' story. And what he's making a point of is helping us understand that it's a very Jewish way of writing to help us understand that these events relate. And so we tend to think, oh, the moral of that story is how Jesus healed the girl and rose her from the dead. And then, and then the other story is he healed this woman that was bleeding. And it's not, but we have to look for how these two parallel each other and what's correct and similar in the two stories. It happens all the time. So go ahead and tell me some more things.
Yeah, so both the girl and the woman are called daughter in that passage, and we're talking in the book of Mark. And this is chapter 5, just if you're looking. And he said, the girl is 12 years old, and the woman has been bleeding for 12 years. So we have daughter, and we have the similarity of 12. Jairus falls to the ground. The woman falls to the ground.
Right.
And he says, clearly, Mark wants us to read the stories together. Most important for our purposes here, Mark's sequencing of the events connects them. he wants us to interpret them together. So he said, we may be inclined to think the story of the bleeding woman is told in the middle of the Jairus story merely because that's when it happened. But in this case, our love for chronological, I can't say the word, chronologically, whatever, can lead us to miss the kairos of Mark's point.
Right. Right. I had another example.
Oh, good.
So in Leviticus 24, there's a story, like we're right in the middle of the law, all the laws being given, and he's going through all the giving of the law. And then right in the middle of it, there's a story about a man who was a son of a woman of Israel, and his father was an Egyptian, and he went out among the people of Israel, and they got in a fight, and the man of Israel, in the course of which was killed, a man of Israel was killed, and the mixed breed person, I'm going to use that for a reason, cursed God, and then he was brought before Moses, and Moses starts going into all these other laws again, and you're like, why do we have this weird story here? Well, when you're reading that in the original language, just like with Jairus and the woman with the issue of blood, you had parallels, like she 12 years old, 12 years, fell down. And so this story, the original here, there's something about that Torah wants to teach you about. And you're like, okay, don't curse God. That must be it. Well, actually, it links directly to Exodus 2:13 through 15, where Moses sees, he leaves the camp, just the same language. He went out. That's the same language. He sees a fight, and in Hebrew, that word fight, those are the only two times in the Bible that word is used. Someone dies. Yeah. And think about the mixed race issue. Well, Moses was an Israelite, but who raised him? An Egyptian. Yes. So you've got multiple parallels. And so the writer of Torah, it's not just that this got inserted, even though these are years separate. I mean, these happened years apart on the timetable. Yeah. They want you to look at it together and then begin to discuss and understand how those parallels happen. So
it's throughout the Old Testament. There's even parallels between the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Judah, with Joseph and his brother, right? And Judah and his brother Benjamin. I mean, those were the two tribes. And then in Saul, or in the story of David, you have Benjamin, the king, Saul from Benjamin, and then David from the tribe of Judah. And like you have these interactions between the tribes, but also the real people. And
I can add another one. Yeah. Go forward to the book of Esther, because it was Judah. Benjamin was the one that was hid away, and Judah was the one that defended him. And then when you go to Esther, Esther was of the tribe of Benjamin. So now Benjamin could stand and defend Judah, because Hamas was going to kill all the Jews of Judah. So, I mean, even when you see those parallels, your mind as a Hebrew thinker should be going, wait, I recognize that word. Wait, I recognize that language. Wait, I got to go back in time. And even though these are hundreds of years apart, something about this season or something about this lesson. So, it's not just a simple, I don't just get the moral of the story. I have to be able to combine both times. I have to look at both times and look at the context and look at the hearer and the understanding of it. And, you make a good point. Everybody loves the verse. I know the plans I have for you. We take that out of time and we think, oh, it's such a great verse for us. God knows the plans. But if you look at it in the context of time, what's going on with them?
Yeah.
Right.
They're in captivity.
Yeah.
Judah. It's about Judah.
Yeah. They're about to get wiped out. And so it's a promise of captivity. And we've taken it out of that time and we've kind of claimed it as my favorite verse.
There's so many examples. Because I mentioned when God gave the instructions to Moses about the building of the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tells him how to build the mercy seat and the Ark of the Covenant. And you see the two angels on top, and you see the blood would have been between. You see all of this being built in Exodus, but then you go far ahead into the New Testament, and here is Jesus put in a tomb. Mary goes in, and what does she see? She sees an angel at the head and at the foot of where Jesus was laid. Right. And you can imagine that his blood was still staining that block of stone. Mm-hmm. So you have the mercy seat now all playing out there. But how many years? Thousands of years between the two events.
Right.
But the Lord knew what was going to happen, so he can look ahead, because time, like you said, it's not linear to him.
Right. It's cyclical. Mm-hmm. So, and think about, look at the Bible story. We know that the restitution of all things, is the beginning of time coming back, coming back to that cycle. We read in the Bible Eden, and then leaving Eden, and then you see the exile, and then leaving Egypt, cutting through the water, and the language is the same. Right. And you have the recreation of the land and the people, if you will. So it's a cycle of things.
And how many people were killed when they bowed down to the golden calf, which happened on Shavuot? Mm-hmm. And so there were 3,000 people killed. What happened in Acts? 3,000 people were
added. Right.
And it was the same feast.
Right.
And so, but thousands of years apart. So you have this cycle that's happening, 3,000 people killed. Now 3,000 people were saved.
I've got another idea that just came to time. This is how bad we mess up time in the Bible. How long was Noah's flood? Everybody says 40 days and 40 nights.
Oh, that's just
it wasn't. It was like a year and a half.
Yeah.
Right? So it's if you go through and actually
count for 150 days, but
not
or something like that. They were in the ark 150 days or something.
Yeah. So it was. If you go through and use a calendar time, and even like I even took it because it says on the first day of the such and such a month. I just said, okay, well, I'll just call that February. And if you do it that way, you can count out the time, and it was a long time. It was
a long time. Yeah, and I think the 150 days was the time that God kind of got back with them and said, "Oh yeah, not that he forgot about them, but it says the Lord remembered Noah, and it had been 5 months or 150 days, and so then you have and even that story is you have creation." And then you have a decreation and a recreation all happening, within in Genesis, in a matter of like 9 chapters, you have creation, decreation, recreation.
Right. I'm going to keep going. Noah gets off the boat, makes a sacrifice, and gets drunk. Okay. He had to plant, it says he planted a vineyard. How long does it take a vineyard to grow before you can grow grapes? It didn't happen the next week.
No.
So we put our time thinking into it.
Lots of stories like that where we need to think this did not happen in a couple of days.
Right.
And even the time that it took for Jesus and his disciples to go from Galilee to Jerusalem, and all the dangers that were between those 2 points that they had to look out for and be careful for, the places they rested. The events did not happen back to back in a 24-hour period. Right. There was time of traveling everywhere because they didn't jump on a bus or a car, right? So
they walked.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting.
It is.
He makes a really good point. And I like this part too. This is on page 150. It says, when the preacher in Ecclesiastics reminds us that there is a season for everything, he isn't talking about a calendar.
Yeah.
He's discerning the right timing. It's an important part of the Christian life. And boy, isn't that a story? To have the discernment of when to say something, when to insert, when to take action, when to, we don't wait for that. We just jump. We do it.
Yeah.
How do we become sensitive to the way Scripture is discussing time in a given context? When you run across a word that indicates time is under discussion, a day, hour, season, opportunity, whatever, decide whether you think the biblical author is talking about chronos or kairos in mind, and go look it up. It's not hard. You can go to Blue Letter Bible, and you can look up those words. And honestly, you'll be surprised. Most of the time it says a season. And how might you interpret the passage differently if the author was describing chronos, specific time, versus if he's describing kairos? So think about that. We've got kingdom language, we've got Eden language, we've got recreation language, we've got, all this honor and shame language. Now let's layer another one, time. Time.
So we are on part 3 begins next week. So we only have about we probably still have about 6 minutes, but part 3 starts next week. It's below the surface. And the next chapter is first things first. So rules and relationships. So that should be, because again, we probably don't even think about the rules and the relationships that are going on in that. And just like you mentioned, even with the Samaritan woman,
right? She couldn't be married if she was a slave. And based on the language that Jesus used, calling her husband a Baal instead of a Ish, it indicates she probably was a slave. And according to laws of that time, slaves were not allowed to be married. So no wonder she didn't have a husband. Leave her alone.
And she could be passed around to different brothers, different masters.
Law of the Levirate too says that she had the right to be married by the next son and the next brother and the next brother, the next uncle. So
we have to understand the culture in those in that context for that story to make perfect sense,
right?
Because she wasn't a prostitute.
No,
she wasn't. She was a broken woman, probably for lots of different reasons. But
I just thought of another time issue. We always assume her to be this young, lovely lady.
Right.
She could have been very old. We don't know. We don't know. She could have been an elder person. If
she had 5
husbands. Yeah. Right. So she would have good chance she was probably a little bit older. So do you want to mention, I don't know if you have the book with you, want to mention what we're going to do next? We've kind of made a decision.
We're actually going to do a Bible study next. We're going to go to the book of Galatians. I had to look at it because I just but so this is when we have different resources we're going to use for Galatians, but we are going to go through. I won't say verse by verse, but we're going to go through and start with one chapter at a time. But we have this, and this is a book not by works of law, but by Messiah's faith alone, Galatians. And this is by Christy Anderson. And it's probably hard to see, but Christy with the C, Anderson. And then also we'll give the ACTS. It's an acronym, A period, C period, T period, S. And that is, there's also a very good video
series, right,
on Acts, and we can give you that as well, that we're defining that, because there's lots of times especially in Galatians where he mentions law more than once, more than twice, and we have to understand what he's talking about, what those words law, they're not all Torah,
right?
So it's a complicated. I won't say it's complicated, but it's a book of the Bible that we need to get right. And many of us think, Paul converted, he left Judaism, he left being a Jew, and different things about what's written in there.
Right. So we've got about 3 more weeks of this book. So this will carry us through at least the month of June. And then I think we'll have a guest speaker come on. We're working on it to kind of introduce Galatians, and then we'll jump into Galatians July or so. And go from there. So I think it'll be kind of interesting. So that's one. You're welcome to purchase the book and join us, of course. But if not, at least read any version of Galatians.
Any version and multiple versions.
Multiple versions.
But true. We also just remember Lamb Network. You can watch our program on Facebook, on YouTube. I have a channel, and then you can always go to Lamb Network and watch our show. Definitely. And even rewatch it on Tuesday morning, right? Like at 11.
Yes.
And and they've got a lot of other shows. So if something doesn't make sense and you want to go and watch our show, then you can. So we'll try to keep you updated on what's coming up. We've got some at the end of the month we're going to record, and I know Lucille had thought that maybe it was this week, but it's the last Friday of the month of June. We will pre-record our show. So that will, just remember, if it's pre-recorded, we won't see your questions. So
that's right. We'll respond to them. We will try to respond to them, but we have a wonderful opportunity to attend a women's Messianic conference. So we're both going to go.
Yeah, we're going to be roommates. Surprise, surprise.
We are. All right. Well, I think we're going to actually start on time and give the next show a little time to get started. So thank you for joining us. Have a good evening and enjoy your weekend, and have a blessed Shabbat.
Shabbat shalom.
If you missed today's show and want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find this show and all of the other live Lamb show archives on the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Stephanie Pavlantos, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.